Hello, today we're going to be looking at Newton's laws, the introduction to Newton's laws. These are going to be a series of short videos just to get the gist of Newton's laws, since we know that grade 11 is very tough and this is all brand new to you. Right, so the first thing we're going to start off with is contact forces. Now, these are forces that objects exert on one another when they touch. So, in order for something to have a contact force, they need to be touching. So, my finger is in contact with this paper, but when we look at something such as gravity, which we cannot touch, that is not a contact force over there, right? But there are two types of contact forces that we're going to be looking at, and that is friction force as well as normal force. Now, it's important to look at both of these over here because we're going to be it includes so much of Newton's laws, right? And we need to understand what they are, so every time I'm talking about it, at least you understand what I'm talking about, right? So looking at a normal force. Now, the normal force is also, as we know already, a contact force exerted by a surface on an object perpendicular to the surface. And that perpendicular is very important because this forms a big section, especially when we are dealing with something on an incline, when we have to start dealing with angles. So here I've got a object over here, and I can see that this object coming down is going to have a gravitational force of Fg, but coming up, I can see that there is a 90 degrees here, perpendicular. So this over here is going to be my normal force, right? And if I have to look at this object over here, I'll do the same thing. Here is going to be coming down, is going to, oh, sorry, that's wrong. Coming down is going to be Fg, but at this 90 degrees, you can see here, because I'm going to have this little perpendicular, that is going to be my Fn, my normal force, which is perpendicular to the surface. Right, that's very important. And then lastly, looking at this over here, we're going to be dealing with our friction force, a contact force exerted by a surface of an object parallel to the surface and opposite to the direction of motion or attempted motion. Now, that attempted motion over there is important because the attempted motion is going to indicate something and motion is going to indicate something. And we have two types of friction force, which is going to be my first one, a static friction. A static friction, where we're looking at my attempted. Static friction is a friction force exerted on an object when it does not move. So when my object does not move, it is because it has not overcome its static friction, right? So if I'm looking at my ear pod thingies over here, if I'm trying to push it, I'm unable to push it over here because I have not overcome my static friction. Okay, I'm trying to push it, or let me go like this rather. I'm applying a force, tiny bit of force, but I can't push it because I have not overcome the static friction. Then your second one is going to be your kinetic friction. All right, kinetic friction is the force exerted on an object when it moves along the surface. So once I have overcome, now I'm trying to push this, once I have overcome my static friction, I now have kinetic friction. And it is easier to move an object once it is already moving. So once it is already moving, I can apply less force and it can still keep moving. But in order to do the initial push, I'm going to need to overcome static friction, which would be a lot higher than my kinetic friction. Right, then please remember that friction force is exerted by the surface is proportional to the coefficient of friction. So the friction force exerted by a surface, so whatever first surface I'm looking for, is proportional to the coefficient of friction. So if I look at my page over here, right, it has a type of coefficient of friction, whereas if I compare it to my sunglasses over here, this friction is very different to this friction over here, this coefficient of friction. The two different surfaces are very different. And because I have two different surfaces, I'll have two different coefficients of friction. And we'll be dealing with this. This over here is going to be looking at our coefficient of friction. So whenever you see this, you know exactly what I am looking for.